Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm gonna show you how I made my first Victorian corset. I was planning on finishing it in November, but didn't really get it done until right before Christmas. Seeing how suitable the color is for this festive occasion, I think my procrastination is justifiable. My original plan was to make this corset from 1876, but decided to give up once I saw the pattern. However, if you are up for this challenge, Liam has made a two-part video using the exact same pattern, so make sure to check that out. I then found another reference from 1878, which is a lot less intimidating to the eyes than the first one. I made some adjustments to the pattern, changed the arrangement of the boning a little bit, and replaced the front button with a metal busk. I really wanted to make an 1870s corset with gussets, so this pattern is perfect for me. I found it on Pinterest but couldn't pinpoint the original source. Still, I shall be sharing the Pinterest link down below. This corset is made of 2 layers of fabric. The inside layer is cotton herringbone couture, which is very stiff and rather thin. For the outside layer, I used this Egyptian cotton sateen. I first traced out the pattern on the couture and went in with a tracing wheel to transfer the boning channels. I drew half an inch seam allowance everywhere except for the center back, which needs 1.5 inch seam allowance to hold the grommets and make the boning channels. The silhouette of the corset is largely influenced by the grain line of individual pieces, so be extra cautious in the direction in which you lay out the pattern. I then overlaid the couture cutouts on top of the sateen and cut out the next layer. This way I could make sure that the 2 layers are completely identical. Once all the pieces are cut, I basted the 2 layers together along the stitch line. I also pat stitched around all the gusset openings to make sure that the fabrics wouldn't move after I cut them open. Once I'm happy with all the basting and pat stitches, I cut open the places where the gussets get inserted. I followed Liam's tutorial and used the sandwich method on these openings. First, fold in the seam allowance of the couture and iron it down. Then flip the piece to the other side, fold the sateen fabric in so that the edge lines up with the couture, and iron it down again. Some of the openings are just one single line instead of a trapezoid, so the way to deal with these are a bit different. Because there is no seam allowance, I folded the fabric in for just 3 mm and tapered it down to about 1 mm at the top. Also, I know I've been using imperial and metric system interchangeably, and that might confuse the hell out of many people, but that's just how my brain works as an international student studying America. Anyway, back to the sewing. I inserted the gusset in between the 2 layers and made sure that the basting on the gusset lines up with the edge of the opening. As you can see, there are 6 layers of fabrics in total around the gusset, and they tend to move a little bit if you baste them all together in one go. So I decided to baste the top 3 layers of cotton sateen first and then baste all 6 together from the back. Before stitching these down, I made sure to adjust the stitch lengths to 2mm to give it more strength. I noticed that in many Victorian corsets, there are 2 rows of stitching along the gussets for reinforcement, so I did the same thing on mine and stitched another line 5mm away from the first. Carefully remove all the basting stitches and the gusset is in. Once all 10 gussets were inserted, I moved on to joining the side seam. Clip into the curve of the back piece so that it folds nicely. Repeat the same steps as the gusset. Fold the seam allowance, iron it down, baste front and back together, stitch 2 rows, and the side seams are done. Next comes flossing. No, not that. Not that either. Flossing is an embroidery technique very commonly used on Victorian corsets. Because there is almost no seam allowance at the points and corners of the gussets, the fabric in these places can fray quite easily. That's why people use flossing to wrap the weak points inside the thread. It's fairly easy to do the flossing, but it definitely takes up a lot of time. I then made all the boning channels. Because the corset is already 2 layers of fabrics, a channel is created simply by stitching 2 rows along the marked line. But before that, I first cut out 2 pieces of 1-inch wide twill tape to serve as a waist tape. This is to make sure the fabrics don't get stretched out along the waist, which is where the corset will be the tightest. The waist tape is stitched down with the boning channels. The 2 center back boning channels are made a bit differently, as the boning is sandwiched in between 4 instead of 2 pieces of fabric. I first marked the position of the boning channels on the front with a heat-sensitive pen, then I folded in the seam allowance. Once the seam allowance was ironed down, the pen mark on the other side completely disappeared as well. I don't know why I would draw the line before ironing the fabric. So I retraced the lines, tucked the waist tape into the seam allowance, and stitched it down. Now there's just one more boning channel left. Because the boning here runs through the gusset, whose top is already stitched close, I had to cut out another strip of couture fabric. Folding the seam allowance on the 2 sides and stitch it down in place. I decided to put the front busk in before inserting the boning. The loop side always goes on the right hand side. I'm not sure why, but that seems to be the case for every single corset I've seen. Mark out the position of the loops on the fabric and pin it together with the facing. While stitching, I would do a back stitch right before the gap, skip to the end of the gap, and do another back stitch so that the thread wouldn't come undone. I then wrapped the waist tape around the busk and stitched it in. Make sure that the loops are all the way in. You can put some clips on it to keep the busk in place. Folding the seam allowance off the facing and baste all of these layers together along the busk. Make sure to go very slowly while stitching so that your needle doesn't accidentally fall over the metal busk and break. For the other side, I first stitched the facing onto the center front. Then I used the loop side as a guideline to mark out the position of the studs. The center front is a bit curved, so I had to rotate the piece a little bit to make sure the lines match. Use an awl to pierce a hole and stick the stud side in. Finally, I could put the boning in. I used flat steel boning as the center back boning, but went with the more flexible plastic boning for the rest. Because there will be 1/2 inch wide binding on the top and bottom of the corset, the boning needs to be 1 to 1.5 inch shorter than the boning channel. For the steel boning, I bent it a couple times with a plier, snapped it off, and smoothed out the edge with a metal file. To prevent exposed metal from rusting, I dipped the tip into this liquid rubber coating which would harden up as it dried. The plastic boning is a lot easier to prepare in comparison. Simply cut it at the right lengths, set the tips on the sandpaper, and it's ready to be inserted. Compared to my 18th century States, which has 108 reed boning, this corset only has 16, which is quite a blessing. Next, I mark the placement of 16 grommets on each side. And it's hammer time. This part is pretty self-explanatory. Punch a hole with the hole cutter, place the grommet and the fabric over a base of the appropriate size, and hammer it down. Make sure to hammer down vertically, otherwise you will end up with a few weird looking grommets like mine. After some not so intensive manual labor, I moved on to making the binding. I cut these out on straight grain instead of bias because they're rather short and don't need to curve around too much. Fold the fabric in half, iron it down, and fold it again to make a 1/2 inch wide binding. I left some extra seam allowance on the top and bottom of the corset because the cotton sateen tends to fray quite easily. I didn't trim off the extra fabric until I had to pin and stitch the binding. So far the majority of the corset is done and all that's left are decorations. While the flossing on the gussets is to prevent the fabric from fraying, I'm now adding flossing on the tips of the boning so that they don't move up and down or poke through the fabric. Aside from its practical use, the flossing was quite a crucial decorative element in Victorian corsets. They were oftentimes done in silk thread of contrasting color, and the design could range from simple geometric shapes to exquisite floral patterns. I naively thought that I was keeping it on the quick and easy side with this triangular shape, but nope, it definitely took me a few days to finish all the flossing. Last but not least is the lace trim. Because it's the Victorian era, so why would someone not have lace on every single garment they own? I cut out a piece of lace 2 inches longer than the binding itself and placed it just a little bit above the binding, so that it covers it all up nicely. When it comes to the edge, simply fold it twice on the back, slip stitch it in place, and the corset is completely finished. This is my first time making a proper Victorian corset, and it took me about 80 hours. Although I made quite a few mock-ups before jumping onto the real thing, I still made it too small and it does hurt after wearing it for a while. It also wasn't until I finished the whole thing that I realized the gusset placement is a little bit off as well. All that being said, I think it was a good challenge to take on as my last project of 2020, plus it's definitely the right color for Christmas and New Year. As always, thank you for supporting me on YouTube, and please subscribe if you want to see more of my sewing adventure. Hope you all have a great holiday and Happy New Year!